Welcome everyone to the August Focus Series. We're really excited today to share a new feature in Target Map Preferences. And I'm excited to share it for two reasons. One is it's something that a lot of you have been asking for, so I think you'll all be really excited to see it, but also because it's a feature that can really amplify your value proposition. So let's get started. So if you think about when you create a target map in Asset Map, you have the option of creating target maps for loss of life or disability or long-term care, education or retirement. And of course, you have the ability to create custom target maps. And you'll know when you create a target map for a client, it automatically defaults the what you want or the needs for that specific target map based on certain settings. Now, up until now, you've had the ability to customize to a certain extent what those needs would be, but now you can really make it your own. So you can put in the words you want to use, the amounts or percentages, the start and end ages, as well as the inflation or escalations. So as we work through this webinar, I'm going to talk through some of the things to think about when creating your target map preferences for each of these different target maps. And it might feel like, oh, it's quite a lot to change it or create it. But remember, it's something that you do once. You set up your target map preferences, and then every new target map you create will automatically have those needs in that what you want section. It's also not something you have to do all of them at once. You can start by picking, the target map that you use the most. Perhaps that's the retirement one or the loss of life one, and you can set up what you want that what you want section to look like. So let's talk a little bit about the why. First thing, by doing that is it saves time. If you've set up your target map preferences, you have those line items under the what you want section that you want to talk to clients about. That is going to save a lot of time in creating target maps. You're not going to have to make, edits each time because you've put the wording in there already. But it's also a great way of incorporating your house view, of bringing that to life, of putting in what are the things that you want to talk to clients about when it comes to retirement or in the event of death or disability. So this change gives you the ability to save time, incorporate your house view, but also open up the conversations that you want to talk to clients about in each of those events. So we're going to talk through each of them, and I just want to go through a couple of things to think about when setting up your preferences for each of the different target maps. Let's start with retirement. So you'll know when you create a retirement target map currently, if you haven't changed any of the settings, then under the what you want section, we've split it into 3 line items. One for living expenses, one for travel, and one for medical. And we've set that at in total 70%, but 50% for living expenses, 10% for medical, and 10% for travel. And the reason we've split it into those 3 different line items is so that you can have different start or end ages. For example, travel might end a bit earlier. It also gives you the ability to set different inflation rates. Now, in medical, you may want to have a higher inflation rate. But now, all of this is completely customizable. So you can really bring in your house view, or what are the things that you want to talk to clients about. So I know for some of you, you might think of retirement in terms of, I want to show clients what their essential needs are, and then perhaps a line item for additional or luxury needs, and maybe a different line item for travel. You can now incorporate this, and that gives you the ability to just, tick it or untick it when having a conversation with a client, so that you could say, well, let's first secure your essential needs, and then we can look at, how do we secure that luxury needs or those travel needs as well, or the impact of that. You can also set the ages. So if you wanted to, run to 95 or start at 60, you can decide that, as well as the inflation rates. Another view or house view that we often see is maybe separating it into periods. So saying, first we have the go-go years, the first 10, 15 years of retirement, that's where we want to have a higher income amount. But maybe then for that second slot from 80 to 90, we, you can call it the slow-go years and then the no-go years. So you could have your house view set up in retirement target map to say, I want to have different sections in terms of from this age to that age, this is the the amount, but then from another age, from 80 to 90, we have a different amount. So you can really bring this in now to your target map preferences and bring that house view to life. I think that's really exciting to say, I don't have to make that change every time in the target map. It's there already as I create it, and now I can start to have that conversation with the clients. Some other things to think about from retirement is you might want to add in a section where you look at, leaving a legacy. That can be a custom line item that you add in. So you're not limited to these 3. You could have 5 or 6 line items if you wanted to. Another one to bring in could be, celebrating retirement. You want to, really highlight that milestone and how are we going to celebrate it. So if these are conversations that you want to highlight or surface in your retirement target map, then adding that in to your target map preferences gives you the ability to do that. So that's on retirement. When we think about loss of life, now remember, when we think about planning for death and disability, we always think about if it happened today, sort of a worst case scenario, it happens today, what would the family's needs be? So the default settings here is around, replacing income. If the client, if death happens today, the client would obviously, that income falls away. So how do we protect that period of when the client would have been earning that income so that the family can still sustain their lifestyle? We have a line item for covering debts in the event of death, or covering costs or final expenses, and of course education for minor children. Now you can specify all of these things. Some things to think about when creating your own target map preference for loss of life is think about that protection period. So it currently defaults from the client's current age till 65. So we're thinking of, in the event of death, we want to protect when the client would have been earning an income, which would have been from now till they retire. It doesn't have to be that period, but that's something to consider. Do I want to protect for whole of life for the spouse, or actually just that period where the client would have been earning? And then we'll look at retirement planning separately for the spouse. So those are some of the things to consider when setting your house view, is what is that protection period that we're looking at? Is it 10 years? Is it 15 years? Is it until the client would have retired? And then to think about what are the other additional costs that could be sort of lump sum costs, things like covering debt in the event of death, or expenses like estate duty or executives fees or capital gains tax. You can now bring in line items, even though you don't know necessarily the amount, you can bring that in. And of course, we've got calculators like the WORK.THAT.MATTERS calculators that's standalone that you can use to calculate what those costs would be, and then bring them into this conversation. So you can really set in loss of life, what are the things that I want to make sure that I've spoken to the client about? It's that income replacement, it's whether that's covering debt, whether that's covering expenses, whether that's a transitional period. Sometimes in the event of death, we say, for the first 2-3 years while we're in transition, maybe the needs are a bit different over that period. We can now bring that in to the what you want section and open and surface those conversations. If we think about planning for disability, here we defaulted to 2 line items. One to say, in the event of disability, again, we're looking at if it happens today, we want to protect the income the client would have earned from now until retirement. But the client is still going to retire, and we need to have a conversation around that lost retirement savings. Maybe instead of just protecting 70%, I actually need to think about protecting 80% so that I can continue to save for retirement in the event of disability. So here we also want to think about what is that period that I want to protect for, and put that into our default assumptions, but also think about how that relates to retirement planning, and am I accounting for that in the event of disability? Okay. Then education as well. So at the moment we put in education expenses. It's 100,000 per annum from when each child is 18 until they're 22. And important here is to think about that inflation rate. We know that education inflation is typically a bit higher than normal inflation, so we want to bring that in. But here again, you can put in your own wording. If you want to put in, covering university costs or full schooling for every minor child and start it, at age 6 as opposed to 18. You can define that. So now we're going to go into asset map, and I'm just going to talk through how you would update your target map preferences. So stop sharing here and just share it back. All right. Okay. So when you go into Asset Map and you want to now update your target map preferences, you'll start by selecting your photo or initials in the top right-hand corner. Once you select that, you'll click on Target Map Preferences. Right. And right at the top here, you'll see you've got the general settings, and then you've got the settings for each of those different target maps. So let's start here on the general settings. The first one you can update is that expected net return on capital. So that is your default return, your starting point. Of course, no matter what you set here, you can always change that in the target map for a particular client or for a particular scenario. But what do you want your default to be? How that expected net return is used, in the retirement and savings goals, that's the value or the return that is going to be applied to all of the investments or savings that's allocated towards that goal. And in terms of the risk planning, if we think about death and disability, how we use that expected return is we think about if death happened today or disability happened today, what cover would the client need or investments would they need to fulfill that what you want needs, so to be able to provide an income or cover debt. And we assume that in the event of death, whatever cover pays out will be invested. And this is the return that it will use. So think about what do you want that default to be for your target maps, your starting points. You can then always increase it or decrease it depending on the clients and their needs. The annual increase of contributions, this is typically your inflation as a starting point. So you want to set that up. That would also be used if there's a shortfall to say, if there's a shortfall of say $1 million, how much would the client need to save each month if they increase it by this percentage? That's what you're setting here. You can also add in a retirement age, your default retirement age. If you want to, start it at 60, you can update that here, or 65, and a mortality age, which is used if there's no end age, it will default to that mortality rate age. And then you can select your default tab. So you'll know when you open up a target map, it either opens up on the what you want, what you have, or what it means. This is where you can set the default. If you always want it to open up on what it means, you can select that. Or if you want to always start the conversation with what you want, you can set it to start there. All right, let's move through the other options. So if I now go to loss of life, you'll see that you've got a whole range of different line items that you can select to include or deselect if you don't want to include that particular line item. But now you can add in the description you want to display. So what is the wording you want to use? If you like to think of it as income replacement or sustaining lifestyle in the event of death, you can now incorporate that wording into these preferences. You can also set the percentage. Do I want the default to be 70% or 100% of what the client's currently earning, or 50% as a starting point? You can go ahead and put that in here. And you can set that income replacement stop age. So what is that protection period in loss of life? If I want to protect till 60 or 65 or 70 or 90, I can go ahead and put that age in here. And then what do I want it to increase by? So I can set the inflation. If you want to use 5 for inflation, you can. Or if you want to use 6, you can update that here. Then you can put in transitional income replacement. This is typically if you wanted to say, for the first 3 years, we want to actually replace an additional 30% so that it's 100% replacement just for that first few years for the family to sort of settle around that. We want to make sure there's more funding. You can go ahead and select that. You can put in the description, the percentage, how long, and how that should increase. Debt obligations. So currently it says debt obligations. I know a lot of you change that to settle debts. You can now put that wording in here and you don't have to make that change each time. And you can set the percentage. You default that typically to 100. So we want to cover all debt in the event of death. Final expenses, here you can set either calling it final expenses, or you could call it, final expenses and estate costs. You could put the amounts in here or leave it as 0 so that you can edit it for a particular client. In addition to that, you can add in line items for emergency reserves if you want to make sure there's emergency funding in the event of death, or even for legacy bequests, to make sure you open up that conversation. You've had a conversation with the client around what are the legacy bequests we want to make sure we can account for in the event of death. And of course, it also adds in education. But now, in addition to that, you can use these line items above, call them what you want to call them to surface the conversations you want to have, but you could also add custom ones. So here I can add in additional custom ones in the event of death with the description I want to display. I can choose whether that should start off as a percentage of income, or I can put in a specific fixed amount, or even leave it as 0 just to surface the conversations that I can have that conversation with the clients and fill in the need as required. And I can add as many of these as I want to my loss of life target map. All right, so that's on loss of life. If we go across to disability, here I have those 2 line items. Remember, one is around replacing income. The other is around continually thinking about, retirement in the event of disability. What do we want to account for here? Now, I know a lot of you have asked for the ability to also settle debt on disability. You'll see that isn't, the custom one isn't an option here yet. That is something we've asked the team to add as well, so that you can account for that. And obviously, the more please use this feature, add in your feedback, and we can invest more in updating that. So at the moment, there is these 2 line items though, where you can put in what descriptions you want to include, what percentage, until when, and how that should increase over time. Then if we go across to long-term care, here we've got 4 different options. One would be an annual amount. So this long-term care is where we talk about, do we have enough illness cover? It's always a difficult one in terms of how do you calculate how much a client should need. I know a lot of you have a house view around this, where we look at 1 year of income or 2 years of income, or a set amount that every client should have. You can now build that into these preferences, either as an annual amount that's for 2 years or 3 years with a specific amount and increasing by inflation, or you could add in things like out-of-pocket medical expenses as a line item. Because I can rename these, I can put in whatever words I prefer, and I can add in the amounts. The things that are available here is, annual care, as well as home modification, care coordination, or caregiver training, but you can call these line items whatever you want. So it could be, 2 years of income replacement, as well as a certain amount for out-of-pocket expenses. Then you can add that wording in here. Under dependent education, again, we could call this university fees or school fees for the entire period. You can set the amounts, you can set the escalation, as well as the start and end ages. And that will apply to any minor children that you create the target map for. And then, very exciting, in retirement planning, you can now change the wording here. So if you want it to be go-go, slow-go, and no-go years, you could fill in those items here. Or you could look at essential needs, luxury needs, and travel, or keep it as living expenses, but name it how you want to. So if it's retirement income required, or whatever the words are that you're changing each time, you can now update these descriptions, choose the percentage that it defaults to, as well as the start and end ages, and put in escalation. Here, you can also use these default items here by selecting and then putting in the words that you want, or you can add them as custom ones. So you can really define exactly what you want to talk to clients about in retirement by adding custom ones, putting in the line items that you want to surface. You can choose whether it's a fixed amount or a percentage of income. You can choose what that percent is, the start age, the end age, as well as the escalation. And you can add as many of these custom ones as you want to really craft your retirement planning. So you can bring your house view in and have surface those conversations with the clients. And then as one additional bonus feature that I'm really excited to share, you'll know that when you create these target maps, they always put in brackets 70% of primary and spouse income, or 10%. And I know a lot of you take that out in each line item. Now under general settings, you have this slider here. And if you don't want those brackets or percentages to show, you simply slide it off. Or if you would like them to show as a default, you keep that slider on. All right. Okay, I'm going to just switch over to close off quickly. Okay. All right. So in closing today, to update your target map preferences, remember you go into Asset Map, select your picture initials in the top right-hand corner, and select target map preferences. Remember that you don't have to do all of them at once. You don't have to make any change now. The defaults are still, there as they were before, but now you can go in, maybe start with one. Which target map do you use the most? Go in, create those preferences for that target map. What is the words you want to use? What is your house view? How do you surface that conversation? You can start with one and then build it up over time. But once you do it once, it's that once off. And then every new target map you create will have the wording that you want to use, the house views, and the conversations that you want to highlight with clients. Okay. Thank you everyone for joining.